about the mix-up again. Um, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the National Barn Alliance and to Michael for inviting me to share this research with all of you. So thanks for being here. Today I'm going to share a little bit of what is actually now my dissertation research. So I'd like to start by providing a real quick and dirty sort of synopsis of the larger project to help contextualize the buildings that I will be sharing with you today, and help explain that'll help explain why I'm discussing them in the way that I am. So my larger dissertation project is focused on southwestern North Dakota, specifically Stark and Hettinger counties. And my interest in is in the intersection of environmental history, immigration, and the modernization of the farm during the Progressive Era. But with that being said, my research is primarily focused on farmhouses. I've chosen this geographic region because it experienced a fairly rapid immigration boom following the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad through the area in the early 1890s. Um, and between 1895 and 1915, nearly all of the land in the county had become either had been either claimed through the Homestead Act or purchased from the railroad. This area is west of what John Wesley Powell had identified as the line of semi-aridity, the 100th parallel. And so this is an area that experiences less precipitation than is ideal for crop agriculture. However, because the Heart and Knife Rivers and their tributaries flow through the county, there's more farming here than in the neighboring counties, where sheep and cattle ranching have shaped the landscape in the past 120 years. Stark County is also an excellent place to study this transitional landscape because even in the 50 miles east to west within the county lines, you can see farms and cropland in the eastern part of the county give way to ranchland in the west. Okay, so I'm analyzing this landscape within a framework of speculation. And this is what structures the chapters of my dissertation, in which I start at the international scale, looking at what brought people to the area, especially immigrant groups from the Eurasian steppe. While the railroad towns and the relative farmland was claimed largely, at least initially, by Americans, Yankees, and some Scandinavians, the vast majority of the county was settled by ethnic groups that were courted by the state and by the railroad companies both. People with a certain agricultural acumen, specifically targeted for the purpose of converting the prairies to wheat fields to production. So chief among these were the Germans from Russia, the Volga-Deutsch, and the German-Hungarians or the Banaters. But there were others, Ukrainians, ethnic Bohemians who immigrated from Crimea. And I should mention specifically, because we'll be looking at one of these farms today, there's a group of about a dozen families in the area who immigrated from the Crimean Peninsula, but families that came from Estonia. So from there, looking at how and why these families moved around in the area and the ways that they did, because there's a surprising number of families who proved their homesteads only to turn around and immediately sell that land and move to other parts of the county. And then tightening the scale, again, I look at the individual farmstead development patterns, and then finally at individual farm buildings and structures to demonstrate how and why farmhouses changed and developed in the ways that they did. So the examples I bring to you today, to the National Barn Alliance, hopefully not disappointingly so, are not so much barns, but granaries, so close. And you may have already surmised from the title of this presentation that we'll be looking at examples of the ways that grain storage and housing have intersected. So while you're probably all familiar with house barns, today I'll be sharing some examples of house granaries, like this one. So this is the Thomas Brown House Granary. It's a very small structure, but a great place to start because it's one of the earliest surviving examples in the county, or was one of the earliest documented of this type of building. So Thomas Braun was born in Karlsruhe in the Beresan district of South Russia, now Ukraine. He was the second oldest son of 10 children. And at 20 years old, he married his first wife. who died 3 years later. And the following year, married his second wife. And 4 years after that, in 1891, at the age of 27, the whole Braun family packed up, picked up, and moved to America. So his wife, his children, his parents, his siblings, and their families. So they sailed from Hamburg through New York to make their way to Yankton, South Dakota, which had been for about a decade at that point one of the key immigration points for the Volga Deutsch on the Great Plains. When they arrived, though, they found that the Browns found that they had missed the land rush. And so they stayed there for only a few months, followed the path laid out for them by immigrants who came before, and made their way by wagon to North Dakota. For reasons that I have yet to figure out, Thomas doesn't seem to have claimed a homestead. There's no record of it in the state. It's possible that he thought the promised quarter section, the 160 acres, was insufficient for farming, accurately so, and or maybe he just found a good deal because he purchased outright a whole section, so 640 acres of former railroad land, 4 times the acreage of a homestead that didn't come with the same legal mandates and strings. There are a lot of unknowns about this house, and without speculating too much, due to the size and the simplicity of the building, it seems pretty likely that the structure dates to about that time, the mid 1890s, although it could be slightly later. Um, it's very possible that before starting construction on the stone building or rock building, to use local terminology, that the family first built a dugout or a sod house to live in while they established the farm. In addition to it being such an early survival, I also chose to start with this example to briefly explain my methodology. So most of the buildings that I'm sharing today come from my own fieldwork. This one, though, is in almost complete ruin today. So what you're looking at, the photographs, come from Father William Sherman's work, a sociologist and priest, professor at North Dakota State University, who is interested in the ethnic traditions of the Northern Great Plains. In the mid 1970s, he surveyed hundreds of buildings, photographing them, taking notes, interviewing descendants, and in some cases, making really rough architectural sketches, like the one you see on the screen right now. Father Bill didn't really measure, though, but he paced things off to provide rough dimensional estimates. And so we need to take some of this type of information that he collected with a grain of salt. But based on Father Bill's notes, sketches, and photographs, I have been able to pull together a fair representation of this building. There are still some lingering questions, like this floating chimney, which seems to suggest that the gabled section of the house was initially divided into 2 rooms. Also, this door on the gable end, which is strange for a German Russian house, but maybe suggests that this rock building was built as an addition on to an existing structure, like maybe a sod house. But instead, let's look at what we can know. This structure was built in 2 phases. So the 2 larger rooms and then the smaller room that is on the left there. We know this because there's no seam in the rock wall between these 2 spaces. The second phase of building is very common addition. It situates a coal shed. You'll notice that the 2 western rooms don't have, so the 2 rooms on the left don't have any of the identifying features of living space. There's no windows or chimneys. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a house and granary. In Stark County, at the turn of the 20th century, granaries proved to be necessary to store a portion of your harvest to sell when demand and thus prices were high. It took some time for the large grain elevators to be established and built, and in the nearby railroad towns. And even then, bringing an entire harvest to market at once was cumbersome and not always possible. So for a short period of time, from about 1895 to 1910, these well-built stone granaries were fairly common in the area. On many farmsteads in the region, granaries were among the first permanent buildings erected. First, because of the importance of the wheat harvest as the primary source of the family's income, and second, because rock construction was preferred for this purpose. It took a little more time, but it better protected from the elements, helped keep the wheat dry. It was also slightly better at keeping pests out. So examples such as this house, the Braun house, demonstrate that how the ways that housing your wheat was on par with housing your family. And idea is made more clearly by the fact that by 1905, Thomas and Elizabeth had 10 children. So even if this house was built onto a sod house, that there would have been tight living quarters. Well, one of the reasons that this house lasted for as long as it did is because even in the 1970s, and was even in the 1970s relatively unmodified, though starting to collapse. Fothergill, sure. Fothergill writes a lot about how the building is falling in on itself. Um, According to census data, the Thomas Braun family was still living on the farm in 1910, but by 1920, he had retired and moved to town, to Richardson. Um, on a county property atlas from 1914, the house is identified as the residence of Martin Braun. This is the eldest son of Thomas and Elizabeth. And Martin had come of age in 1907. He married in 1912. So it's really likely that he had taken over the farm around that time, though his father still owned the land. Also, part of the reason that it survives in this really early state is because Thomas died somewhat suddenly, according to local newspapers, in 1923. And shortly after that, Martin moved off of this farmstead, establishing a new farm, abandoning it, and establishing a new farm about 10 miles to the north, elsewhere in the county, to accommodate his own growing family of 10 children. To provide a little architectural context, I'll move to the George and Genevieve Weiler granary. Also a German-Russian family. The Weilers came to America in 1906, both in their late 30s, following a brother who had arrived 4 years earlier. The Weiler granary is the only surviving building on this homestead, which speaks to the remarkably well-built structure. And this is a fairly typical example of the type of large stone granaries found in the region. It's a little unique because it has this sort of two bay this two bay form. Um, as far as we can tell, the on the left is the granary portion, and then on the right was possibly used for grain storage at times, or as like overflow storage. Also uses as machine store. Um, Excuse me. So stone granaries such as this typically have these very large full bay openings near the center, often with a sliding door. And while those doors are missing here, you can still see the metal rails that the doors once hung on. So that large bay door opened into a central aisle, on either side of which wooden partitions would divide the interior into bins, which could be used to divide cereal crops, wheat, oat, barley, rye. Typically, these partitions were adjustable. You could build up the walls as they filled or removed sections to empty the bins into a wagon parked in the aisle. The partitions are missing here, but you can see remnants in the back of this picture. Also, you can see ghost marks on the wall where they once stood. So the building has 2 foot thick stone walls, plastered inside and out with a mud hay mixture that they refer to as gumbo, and whitewash to help protect the crop from water and pests and mold. Windows in the gable walls and holes cut into the roof made it possible to fill the bins from above as they filled with grain. A second example of the type located on the Raymond and Margareta Frank farm is similar in size and form. According to the current owner and descendant of the homesteader, this building was almost exclusively used for wheat storage. They had a separate building for the other cereals that for the other cereals that they harvest, and the building that they referred to as the oat barn. Um, was demolished about 30 years ago. You can see it in this photograph on the right. The back on the right is the oak barn. The family also sometimes stored excess grain on one end of the haymow over their livestock barn. So Ray Frank's family. Ray Frank was the oldest son of Michael and Mariana Frank. Ray's uncle Rudolph and Rudolph's family came to America in 1890, followed by an uncle George, 1891, and then Ray's younger brother Stefan, at 24 years old, came alone in 1897. And the following year, 1898, Ray, his wife and children, his parents, and the rest of his siblings came as well. They all homesteaded as they came of age. And knowing this and taking advantage of this, the father, Michael, chose a homestead in what was at the time a very sparsely settled part of the county, about 15 miles south of Dickinson. This was inconveniently far from town, from market, from church. But he chose this place together. He chose this place so that together with his children, they could form a large collective family farm. And the daughters were married off strategically to further expand that. And it grew further yet with the purchase of adjoining lands from the railroad or as they became available. And Ava, one of the Frank daughters, married Nicodemus Hecker. In 1898, Nicodemus's parents, Jacob and Attilia Hecker, and their seven children left their village of Regwa near the Munchen colony in South Russia for a new life of greater opportunity on the American Great Plains. Arriving in Dickinson in late summer, and not atypical of new arrivals, they bought a house in town while they scoped out potential homesteads. This time allowed them to connect with kin, to meet other newly arrived German Russians in the area, and they remained in Dickinson for about 4 years, during which time Jacob worked as a farmhand and a day laborer to save up money necessary to start a homestead of his own. The Hackers likely met the Frank family while living in Dickinson. As they both arrived in 1898, they attended the same church. When Jacob chose a homestead site 13 miles south of town in 1903, it was only about 2 miles northeast of Michael and Mariana Frank's homestead, who had chose their plot 2 years earlier. It's likely that their neighboring homesteads were purposefully orchestrated, as Michael Frank Jr., the eldest unmarried son, married the eldest unmarried daughter, Anna, in 1904, uniting the families. So upon coming of age, Jacob's son Nicodemus took up a homestead of his own about a mile to the southeast of his father's, and then in 1909 he married Ava Frank. Nick approved the homestead in 1911, and around that same time he purchased a half section 2.5 miles east to set up a new farm. It seems likely that had initially homesteaded to increase the size of his father's holdings because at the time he was 23 and a bachelor, and he chose land on the other side of what was then vacant land, section 13. But after marrying Ava and proving up, it was time for him to set up a farm of his own. So he purchased from the railroad land adjoining the Frank family holdings, building a house and barn out of local stone, likely quarried at one of the rocky outcroppings common in the area. The house that Nick Hecker built, probably around 1912, looks very much like the traditional three-room German-Russian house form, but in reality, it was built as a house and granary. Again, not too much is certain about the dwelling portion of the house. The building has been really modified repeatedly since the 1920s, and has been converted into a workshop and garage, and the roof has been replaced. But it seems very likely, based on the window placements, that the living quarters were originally divided into 2 or 3 rooms. The central section originally contained a single loaded rather than double loaded granary with space for 2 grain bins. And this building also had an early addition that, according to descendants, was built as a poultry house. So just as with the Brown House granary, you can compare the amount of living space to grain storage, demonstrating the importance given over to the crop. So Nick's second farmstead in 5 years' time. We don't know what the buildings on the original homestead were. They're likely already gone by 1914 because they're not identified on the atlas. Maybe they were temporary buildings, only erected to meet homesteading requirements. Maybe nothing was actually built there. Or it's just as likely that the buildings were dismantled, taken apart for materials, brought 2 miles over to build these buildings here. But even with the benefit of living on his in-laws' expanded farm, it was difficult for Nick and Ava. They had two sons born in 1911, 1913. They likely only lived on this farm until 1917 or 1918 because Nick sells the property and the family leaves for new opportunities in California. The purchaser, Ralph Sticka, was married to Ray and Maggie Frank's daughter. When Ralph bought the property, it was a starter farm, but he did build a new house so that his family didn't have to live in a granary. Uh, Ralph and Otelia only lived on the property for about 10 years before leveraging it to buy a larger farm further south, selling it to a Rudolph Dukart, who is a grandson-in-law of Michael Frank. So I'm throwing a lot of names. It doesn't matter. The point that I'm trying to make is that this family is doing everything that they can do to keep all of this land within the family and to keep expanding the farm property. So on the Hecate farm, Rudolph built a large wood frame addition to the front of the house, moving the kitchen out of the traditional central spot and carving out family space and private bedrooms, so modernizing the home. Well, the examples that we've looked at so far have all been German Russian farmsteads. This isn't purely a cultural tradition. And sure, you can argue that, like house barn examples elsewhere in America, that it's not uncommon in German cultural tradition to build combination dwelling agricultural buildings. But then again, it's not a practice specific to Germanic peoples. The point that I want to argue is that this is the 20th century. These are very conscious decisions, deliberate choices. In some cases, they're hauling the stone by tractor or truck or jeep. The landscape on the Great Plains, largely devoid of trees for lumber, the bricks for the chimneys, the lumber for the roofs, the joists, the trim, the doors, the flooring, the windows, most of the furnishings are all purchased in town and brought out to the farms. And not to mention that house kits are available for sale at the time. So you have examples like the Karl Huff farms, the house, which was built at the turn of the century by a German-Russian family, and demonstrates that not everyone chose to maintain that building tradition. The Brinkmeyers, the Frank's neighbor to the south, built a kit house at the same time that Ray Frank was building his house in the traditional form. And even within the Frank family, Ray's younger brother Michael built his house at the same time, if not just before Ray, and chose instead to build a much more American style home. In Russia, the German colonies were organized into villages, Dorfen, which where all the houses were built on small lots. Agricultural buildings were built on the edges to be accessible to the surrounding farmland. So familial networks meant that not every family member needed to establish an individual farm, build new farm buildings. And this is the idea that settlers like the Franks had brought with them and tried to recreate in America. Communities built around these kinship networks. However, the American system stood in the way of realizing this, as the Homestead Act dictated 160-acre claims. And so instead of your neighbors being earshot away, they were a half mile down the road. This may also help explain why Nick Hecker left. He was a teenager when he came to America, so perhaps too young to develop the same traditional values. He had homesteaded to expand his father's farm, and then he purchased land to help expand his in-laws' farm. So in his 30s, he decided to pursue other opportunities, perhaps realizing the vision that he had in coming to America. So I want to end with one final example that's slightly yet significantly different. Uh, the Fred and Anna Plasma House. Fred and Anna were culturally Estonian. They were both born on the Crimean Peninsula. They immigrated in 1903, and Fred filed his naturalization intent in 1905 in order to claim a homestead. So this house, built around that time, is a three-bay, single-pile farmhouse that's somewhat typical of immigrant housing in the region, with a notable exception that warrants our attention. So I've been talking around the typical house plan a bit, but this is the best example that I brought today to demonstrate this form. So an essay published by Joseph Schnur in the 1967-68 volume of Der Heimatbuch, um, the author provides us with generalized house plans that were common in the German colonies in Russia, recognizing while he recognizes that there's always some degree of variation, he argues that while in Russia the most common house form and the pinnacle of German housing on the Eurasian steppe was 3 rooms wide and 2 rooms deep. The central rooms were the kitchens, understood something like a divided kitchen and scullery, and then a Staatsstube, a stateroom, the parlor bedroom, and then additional sleeping spaces for the rest of the family. And this house type, this house form, though present, wasn't as common in North Dakota, but rather this is what the community tended to aspire to. So instead, the characteristic form in North Dakota was a single pile version, again, with that central kitchen flanked by bedrooms, which he identified as the front room, the Vorstube, and the back room or the Hinterstube, again, flanking that central kitchen. That front and back designation reference I mentioned references the way that these houses are arranged on small lots in the villages in Russia, with the gable end oriented to the street. So the front room is literally fronting onto the street. Houses turned on their sides, so sort of. Um, that Vorsheba can be understood as the part of the bedroom. It's typically the parents' room, typically the largest room, has the highest level of finish, contains a parental bed, usually a parlor stove, and often sitting furniture. And then the Hinterstube is a smaller bedroom, sometimes divided into 2 spaces, as we see in the plasma house. If we go there, a bedroom and then a stair hall that leads to the attic upstairs. So the the Hinterstube is typically the smallest room in the house. Is typically a sleeping space for children or for guests. And this is essentially the form of the plasma house. So one enters into that central kitchen. One end is the parlor bedroom. Opposite is a smaller bedroom, and a back room, which was used as sort of a pantry that the plasma family referred to as a chamber. And within, there's a steep stair that leads up to the attic space. Also typical of this house form, but no longer extant on this example, most of the steppe immigrant houses in the Dakotas also contain a Vorhausel, which is a building tradition that was adopted from Russian houses on the steppe. It's essentially an enclosed vestibule, an intermediary space that helps the wind and dust and snow stay out of the house. What makes this house extraordinary is the attic. So here we have a beam which runs longitudinally through the center of the house. This functions structurally a little bit differently from a summer beam, for those of you familiar, as the ceiling joists are not paired and sitting atop the element, but the joists span the full width of the house, and they don't rest on top of this beam, but instead are lashed to or hung from, there we go, hung from from this beam with metal hooks. And what this did, there we go, this the metal hooks you see there. And what this did was it reinforced that attic floor, something that wouldn't have been necessary if the attic were used in the typical manner as sleeping space, especially because it typically was children's sleeping spaces, as they tended to be less affected by the low ceilings. Instead, this is significant because the plasmas reinforce this attic for grain storage above rather than alongside the living space, as we saw in the other examples. Large openings on each end provide access from the exterior, and the house is banked into the landscape, which could have helped provide access from above, as we saw in the other granary examples. The Plasma family continued to use the space for grain storage even after they completed their standalone granary. This is a pretty ingenious solution and one particularly attuned to the lived experience of the North Dakota environment. Both siting the house within the landscape like this encourages the northern winds up and over the house, and filling the attic with insulating grain would have helped keep the living quarters warm in the Dakota winter. So, tying this example back to my previous point, these are very conscious decisions that adapt building traditions to the new environment. And I wanted to end on this example because it contains the perfect visual representation as metaphor. The organization of space within this house, that is house below and grain store above, helps explain the two doors in the east wall of the kitchen. So the door on the left leads into the Heinstube, the small bedroom. This door, like all of the others in the house, save the one on the right, is a catalog purchase for panel wood door. And these demark the living, refined spaces of the house. The door on the right is handmade of beadboard laid in a chevron pattern, an interpretation in available materials of a Germanic form that was more commonly used in agricultural buildings. So if the door on the left signals living space, then the one on the right indicates the split use of the building as the door to the quote unquote granary. In 1974, the first parts of Father Sherman's survey work took the form of an essay called Prairie Architecture on the Russian Germans of the Russian German settlers, which was published within and included as a sort of coda to the first English translation of Richard Salad's doctoral dissertation for the University of Königsberg, called translated as Russian German Settlement in the United States. Sherman closes his essay with this quote I have up on the screen. He says, any house, to a certain extent, is a monument to the family that erected it. The Russian German house stands as a shrine to its builders in a double sense. As a building, it reflects the special values of its makers: agrarian, utilitarian, durable, earthy, and well adapted to both harsh and happy circumstances. In a wider sense, it is the history of its people written in large and permanent letters. The initial German heritage is present in its outlines and wooden structures. The many generations of Russian living are spelled out clearly in the materials and overall feeling. And today, the modifications brought about by first, second, and third generation American living are present, seen in the machine siding and dormers and the porches which were added to adorn the exterior. And while I don't disagree with the broader intention behind this prose, you can hear in this passage his dismissal of American influence as something almost superfluous, without significant meaning. And this is where my work starkly departs from the project begun 50 years ago. Sherman's argument was exceptionalism squelched by acculturation, the loss of some sense of authenticity, and the ending of a way of life. And my research moves beyond acculturation, which is reactionary. It's the reaction to the pressure of outside forces. And instead, it moves to a framework of accumulation and speculation. So the house granaries of Stark County are neither devoid of cultural precedent or custom, nor are they something adopted from American culture that supplants traditional building. Instead, the buildings like these represent the accumulation of lived experience, and this accumulation is evident in a much more significant way than simply machine siding and dormers and porches added to adorn the exterior. So rather, working within and persevering through a domineering culture in an often unforgiving environment as a way to create a new sense of cultural continuity, to speculate and envision a collective future. Thank you.
Okay, well done, Travis. You got some time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, if you'd like to, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask away. If you also want to add those into or type your comment or question into the chat, I will keep tabs on that as well. And don't be shy. I think there was one already, which maybe I can adapt to the granary kind of aspect. But the oldest granary kind of house combos that you've looked at, you were mentioning obviously 1890s. Does that change with the East versus West, or again, can you provide some dates on in terms of sequencing, maybe?
Yeah, so the in terms of sequencing, so the those dates sort of come from there's a big land survey done in 1895 that shows that only the easternmost um, three townships of the county are being settled at that time. And so there is sparse settlement from earlier. I mean, settlement in Stark County began in the 1870s. So there are some ranchers living out there, um, both in Stark and Headinger County, who came before the railroads. But those ranchers aren't typically building these same sort of granary buildings. They're building, sod houses and stables, rock stables. So, in looking for this particular type of building, the earliest one that we've been able to find is that Peter Braun example. There are some examples of house barns out there as well that I don't really talk about. We're not sure if any of those sort of predate this or not. And the hard part too is that so many of so many of the settlers, the first buildings that are built are dugouts or are made of sod, and those things just don't last. There are very, very few sod houses left out there. A few more houses that have some sort of sod elements, like maybe interior walls, that survive, or something that has been otherwise encased. But for a lot of these rock buildings that we're looking at, are going to be the second, third building on a site, and that first building has been gone for a long time.
Thank you, Travis. Other questions folks have? Again, I know there's some great comments about your beautiful illustrations, and I would agree with that as well. Well done in terms of the graphics, easy to follow, nice to understand, and really well put together.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we try.
Well, again, if folks have questions later on and want to kind of pass those along via email, I'm happy to kind of send those to Travis, and maybe you can reach out. And again, I think well done, Travis. Again, sorry to rush you at the beginning and the miscommunication. It was suggested, and I know we've had that issue in the past with Eastern, Central, and Western and Mountain Time and everything else. But you recovered very well, and I enjoyed the presentation thoroughly.
Right, thank you all.